Welcome to Obscure Chronicle, where the past is not a spectacle, but a stillness. Tonight, we journey to the far north, to longhouses wrapped in snow, where the fire cracks low and the wind hums against the timbers. Here, winter isn't just endured, it's woven into daily life. Whether you're here to rest, to imagine, or to slowly drift into sleep, you found a quiet space made for wandering minds. If the story brings you peace, if it gives your thoughts a softer place to land, I'd be truly grateful if you'd like the video or subscribe to the channel. Now pull your blanket a little tighter, let the cold stay outside, and together let's step softly into the hush of winter and the heart of a Viking village. The sky was still the colour of slate, and the snow outside lay undisturbed, crisp, shallowly glittering, and held close to the world under a deep northern silence. Inside the longhouse, the day had not yet begun in earnest. The fire, burned down low during the long night, released only a gentle breath of heat. Its red-orange embers gave the packed dirt floor a rusted glow, casting slow drifting shadows against the inner beams. High in the smoke hole above, frost had formed a white ring around the opening, like breath crystallized mid-air. The family still slept, limbs curled into shapes against the cold, heads pressed beneath furs stitched from the hides of deer, sheep, and fox. The warmth of 6 bodies was shared between woven wool and old pelts, the kind that held the scent of ash and lanolin and long winters past. There was little sound, only the occasional shifting of wood overhead, the faint rattle of snow sliding from the roof. And somewhere nearby, the muted clucking of 2 hens housed inside for the season, scratching at straw in a small wooden pen near the door. It was Solveig who rose first. She always did. Her knees creaked as she moved to a sitting position, and for a moment she paused, half blind in the dark, wrapped in silence and thought. The aches in her joints were not new. They arrived with the frost each year, and though unpleasant, they were familiar, like old spirits who returned faithfully each winter. With a slow motion, she slid her legs from beneath the shared coverings and set her feet to the cold floor. The dirt was dry and clean, covered near the bed platforms with woven mats of straw that softened the chill. She gathered her shawl, wrapped it around her shoulders and stood. The hearth was the heart of the house, and it greeted her like an old friend. The fire was nearly out, but still alive. A few glowing coals waited under the ash like the eyes of some beast half sleeping. Solveig knelt and leaned in, the tips of her fingers quick and sure as she brushed away the top layer of ash. She knew how to read its patterns, which coals would catch again, which needed to be left. From a small basket beside the hearth, she took a few curls of birch bark, a dried mushroom cap, and shavings of pine. She placed them in a careful cone, then added kindling, twigs gathered and dried near the entrance weeks earlier. When she leaned close and breathed gently into the coals, it was not with urgency, but patience, as though asking rather than demanding. The small flame caught. The longhouse shifted with the faintest crackle of light. Around her, the forms of her family began to stir. First, her eldest daughter, Ulva, turned slightly, drawn by the scent of smoke and the promise of warmth. Then the twins, Brenna and Sigrid, moved as one, still pressed against each other beneath their thick goat-hair blanket. Her husband, Halvor, remained still, his great shoulders turned toward the wall, breathing deeply through a thick mane of greying hair. Only the youngest, Rurik, sat up fully, his dark eyes open and clear. He was always an early riser, and this pleased Solveig. He reminded her of her father, curious, patient, quiet. "Shall I help?" he whispered. His voice was still light, uncracked by age, but full of steadiness. She nodded and passed him a log from the stack nearby. He moved carefully, placing it on the coals. The fire caught it easily, and a new glow spread into the shadows. Now, as warmth returned to the room, The longhouse began to wake in earnest. The Norse longhouse was a simple construction, yet deeply efficient. Made of timber and thatch, packed with sod and clay, it held the heat close. The ceiling was high in the centre, sloping down on either side, with thick beams that supported not only the roof, but the lives beneath it. There were no windows, but slits in the walls let in thin light during the day. In winter, these remained mostly closed with hides, to keep the warmth in and the frost out. At the hearth, Solveig ladled water into a small iron pot and hung it above the fire to warm. Beside it, a flat stone already sat heating, soon to be used for bread cakes. She moved slowly, rhythmically, as if the morning were a kind of prayer. Outside, the cold waited patiently, but inside, life had begun. From a corner basket she retrieved dried grains, barley mostly, and crushed them in a small hand mill. The twins had risen now and moved to sit near the fire, yawning without shame, hair wild from sleep. They took turns grinding the barley with lazy, practiced strokes, eyes still half shut. Halvor finally stirred. He rose with a groan and walked stiffly to the door, where he opened it just long enough to step outside and breathe in the morning. The door let in a gasp of frigid air that made the girls squeal and pull their cloaks tighter. Outside, the village was quiet. The snow was thick, but the sky was clear, cloudless and sharp, the blue of river ice. Thin threads of smoke curled up from neighbouring homes, and somewhere to the east, the mountains glowed faintly with pre-dawn light. The world was hushed. Beneath that hush, a low, deep hum seemed to run through everything, through the snow, the trees, the stone, and the breath. Halvor stood for a moment, silent, then stepped back in, closing the door behind him. By now, bread cakes sizzled on the flat stone near the hearth. They were plain, made only of crushed barley and a pinch of salt, but filling. Alongside them, a small clay dish of lard melted gently, to be spread across the surface of each cake before eating. Solveig passed one to each child and then to Halvor, who grunted his thanks. They ate in silence, the way winter breakfasts often went, slowly, without rush, listening to the fire crackle and the hens murmur softly in their corner. It was Ulva who broke the silence. "I dreamed of a wolf," she said, tearing her bread cake into 2 pieces. Solveig looked up. "A grey one?" Ylva nodded. "Then it's only a reminder," Halvor said with a shrug. "Fenrir runs through all dreams this time of year." The mention of Fenrir, the great wolf of Norse myth who would devour Odin at Ragnarok, was neither comforting nor frightening. In their world, gods and monsters were not things of fantasy, but companions to everyday life. Their presence in dreams was part of the weave of the world. "He was running beside me," Ulva added softly, "but he didn't look at me." "Then it's a good dream," Solveig said. "He runs with you, not from you." The children grew quiet again, each considering the idea. Later, Halvor would take Rurik to the edge of the forest to check the lines and snares. The twins would help scrape hides that had been stored near the barn. Ylva had herbs to sort and more wool to card, but none of that rushed forward yet. The morning was still stretching, still quiet. And as the warmth from the hearth continued to grow, the longhouse filled again with the gentle sounds of a family returning to life. The scrape of tools, the murmur of small voices, the steady rhythm of hands working cloth and wood. Outside, snowflakes began to fall, slow and wide and drifting, like ash from a great and silent sky. As the light deepened and shadows drew shorter along the sloped walls of the longhouse, the house settled into its rhythm. Outside, the wind tugged gently at the sod-covered roof, scattering small flakes of snow across the packed earthen lane beyond the door. But inside, the hearth had bloomed into full flame, painting everything in hues of copper and rust. Solveig stirred a small iron pot of broth suspended from the fire hook. It was thin, a morning broth, made from bones simmered the night before, flavoured only with a pinch of wild juniper and a sliver of onion, carefully dried and stored since early autumn. Food was never wasted. What grew in summer was carried like treasure into the long winter. Near her, a flat wooden board rested on a stool. Upon it lay several items of daily use, worn smooth with time. A horn spoon, its edges darkened from heat, a woolen pouch holding dried angelica root, a wooden spindle wound with fresh yarn from Ulva's morning spinning. Nothing in the Viking home was idle for long. Every object bore the marks of many hands, mended, shaped, repurposed. Rurik sat nearby, using a small bone awl to poke holes into a leather strap. It was for his boots, which had loosened from the snow's damp. His tongue stuck slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration, and Solveig smiled to herself. A leaf, long gone but never forgotten, always bent over some stubborn task with quiet determination. Across from him, Ylva twisted flax into a second length of cord. Her hands moved automatically, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. She paused only when her father entered again, this time brushing snow from his shoulders and holding a handful of slender branches, pine, spruce, and a piece of dry alder that he laid near the hearth. "Good wood for night fire," he murmured, mostly to himself. The scent of the new wood blended with the iron-sweet broth, and the house filled with that particular perfume only known to cold countries, a mix of warmth and survival, of ancient air and ever-turning time. In a corner of the long house, set slightly apart, hung the family's most precious domestic items, not valuable in gold but vital in living. There was a carved wooden ladle passed down for 3 generations, smooth thin where hands had gripped it. A whetstone from a trading post far south, rumoured to come from the Frankish coast. A small iron cooking knife with a handle inlaid with bits of antler. These were not merely tools. They were memory, pressed into utility. Solveig moved to the back wall and removed a cloth-wrapped bundle. She unrolled it carefully, revealing a thick beeswax candle saved for special moments. Ylva looked up. "The story candle?" she asked. Her mother nodded. These candles were not used for tasks. Too precious for that. They were saved for evenings when stories were told, when the night outside stretched long and silent and begged to be filled with something warm. Solveig lit the wick with a splinter from the hearth. The small golden flame flared and then settled, casting a soft, honeyed glow that melted the corners of the room into shadow. The children gathered closer without being asked. "It was in the time before memory," Solveig began softly, voice slow and sure, "when the gods still walked the land like men, and the winds were younger than they are now." Ylva leaned against the timber post beside her. Rurik rested his chin on his knees, eyes wide and still. "In those days," Solveig continued, "there was a man named Ragnar, son of Sigurd, who wore a coat of furs sewn with the hair of wolves, and who sailed a ship carved with dragons' heads." She paused, letting the flame flicker gently. "He was not a god, though he was favoured by Odin himself. He was clever, strong, and known for walking calmly into danger, as if death were merely another man at the table." "Did he fear nothing?" Rurik asked, almost whispering. "He feared little," Solveig said, "but he loved much, and in that was his weakness, and his strength." The myth of Ragnar Lodbrok was known in many households, but each family told it a little differently. In Solveig's version, the winter made him more human. She told of how Ragnar once spent a whole season in a snowbound village not unlike theirs, how he hunted not for glory, but for the starving, how he gifted his own cloak to a child he did not know. "He said," Solveig murmured, "that any man can swing a sword, but only the strong can share a fire." She let the story trail off into silence as the candle guttered gently. No one spoke for a time. Even the hens in their corner seemed to sleep. Later that evening, As the children returned to their small tasks, carding wool, polishing tools, organizing the week's dried herbs, Halvor spoke quietly. "Tomorrow we will clean the traps," he said, "if the snow lifts." "And if not?" Ylva asked. "Then we wait," he said simply, "as the sea waits for spring." It was an old phrase, and a true one. In Viking lands, winter was not something to conquer. It was something to respect, to live with. You did not fight the cold. You sat beside it. You learned from it. Solveig wrapped the candle again and tucked it into the pouch. The flame was out, but the warmth remained. In the corner, a small wooden idol of Thor, carved roughly but with care, leaned against the wall beside a bundle of dried sage. Behind it, a knot of pine branches had been tucked for luck, and above them, hung from a cord, was a charm in the shape of a hammer, Mjolnir, made from stone and worn smooth from touch. Rurik ran his fingers across it every morning before his boots. "Do you think Thor walks the forests?" he had once asked. "Not now," Solveig had answered, "but perhaps once, and perhaps again some day." Outside, the snow thickened. The world grew quieter. Inside, the longhouse held its breath, in warmth, in memory, in the slow, enduring work of simply being alive. And the fire, low but steady, whispered stories only those willing to wait could hear, thin by the grey snow clouds that clung low over the valley. It wasn't the kind of light that filled the home with brightness, more a lifting of the blackness, a gentle grey that shimmered faintly through the seams of the longhouse roof and around the carved edges of the smoke hole. It was enough. Halvor had risen early, as always. The cold did not wake him. He woke before it. There was a rhythm to his breath, to the act of sitting up in the dark, wrapping his furs around his shoulders and touching the ground with his bare feet, as if to remind himself he was still rooted here, still of this land. The hearth had not died during the night, a testament to Solveig's careful banking of the coals before sleep. Only a few soft breaths of birch bark and straw were needed to coax it back into fuller flame. The heat spread slowly, a creeping balm over the cold floor stones. Halvor placed 2 large stones near the edge of the hearth, turning them gently with his foot to heat them evenly. These were the warming stones, large, smooth river stones, flattened and washed clean in summer and kept near the fire all winter long. They were not special in the way one might think. No runes were carved into them, no gods prayed over them. But they had a purpose, and that made them sacred in their own quiet way. These stones would be wrapped in scraps of wool and placed at the feet of sleeping children, or nestled into cloaks before a journey. Sometimes, Solveig would use them to warm the inside of bread before a meal. Heat held in stone could mean a morning without shivers, a night without stiff fingers. Halvor picked one up with a fold of wool, still too hot. He set it back down. In the longhouse, the day was beginning with the same soft, inevitable momentum as snow falling from a pine bough. Rurik was the first child awake today. He stretched, blanket sliding from his shoulders, and blinked sleepily toward the hearth. His nose was pink with cold. The winter air still lived inside the house despite the fire's steady work. He sat up, pulling on his woolen tunic and slipping his feet into fur-lined slippers stitched by his mother the year before. Nearby, Ylva stirred beneath a fur cover. She did not rise as quickly. Her dreams still lingered. Her hair, dark like her mother's, had loosened from its braids and now spread around her head like the quiet of dusk. "I dreamed of walking through a hot spring," she murmured softly, eyes still half-lidded. "And it smelled like the sea." "Lucky," Rurik replied, rubbing his arms briskly. "I dreamed of frostbite." Their laughter was quiet, breath puffing in the cold. It melted fast near the fire. Solveig was preparing the morning drink, a mixture of water steeped with dried linden flowers and a pinch of yarrow. It warmed the body more gently than ale or mead, and soothed the morning throat. Ylva called it sun water, though no sun had been seen in weeks. As they sipped from carved cups, horn for the adults, wood for the children, Halvar turned the stones again, nodding with satisfaction. He passed one to Rurik, who flinched at first, then smiled as the wrapped warmth sank into his lap. "We'll use the second one for the benches," Halvar said. "I'll pack it under the sheepskins." "Will it last until evening?" Ylva asked. "If the fire keeps it company," he said. Outside, the world was still white and slow, but there was work to do. Today was a day for repairs, not grand building or deep forest hunts, but the slow kind of labour that kept the bones of the home intact, the kind done with thread and hammer, with patience and warm breath. The wooden sleigh, used only when the snow was thick enough to protect its worn runners, had cracked along one side. Halvar would reinforce it with strips of boiled leather, stretched tight and nailed with iron tacks traded from the coast. Solveig was mending mittens, restitching the seams where Rurik's restless fingers had pulled too hard. She used sinew thread softened in her mouth, and a bone needle that had belonged to her mother. These small tasks were how Viking homes endured the long dark, 1,000 tiny acts of maintenance, layered like snow upon snow, no one moment heroic, but together forming the path forward. As the sleigh repair continued, the children were sent to fetch snow from near the path and pack it into barrels just inside the entry. Meltwater would be needed for the wash later, clothing, hands, and occasionally feet. The barrels, dark-stained from years of use, smelled faintly of wood smoke and sap. Rurik grumbled as he scraped at the snowbank. "My fingers are freezing." Ylva handed him one of the warmed stones wrapped in cloth. "Hold it between loads. Father says your bones move better if they're not complaining." He took it somewhat grumpily, but after a minute his expression softened. The warmth crept up into his fingers like sunlight finding old stones. Later, when the day's tasks were paused for a midday bowl of porridge, thickened with a bit of goat milk and crushed hazelnuts, they sat together on the low benches, sheepskins beneath them, the warming stone still radiating gently beneath the seat. Halvar leaned back, eyes half closed. "My grandfather used to sleep with stones," he said suddenly. "Why?" Rurik asked, licking a bit of porridge from his spoon. "There weren't always enough furs to go around," Halvar said. "Stones were constant. You could count on them to keep their heat if you treated them kindly." He paused, spoon hovering. "He used to say stones are like old men, slow to warm, slow to cool, and never in a hurry." The fire popped once, and the scent of porridge and spruce needles mingled in the still air. That evening, as the wind outside grew bold again and the shadows thickened against the longhouse walls, the family gathered for another story. Not all stories were of gods or men. Some were of the world itself. Solveig told of a landvættir, a land spirit, who guarded a hidden spring near her childhood home. If you brought warm stones to the edge of the spring in winter, she said, the spirit would send you dreams of summer, green dreams, and if you listened closely, the stones would hum with songs the wind had forgotten. "Did you ever hear them?" Ylva whispered. "I thought I did. Once," she said, "but maybe it was only the fire talking." And so, with their bellies full, their fingers mended, and their warming stones tucked under their furs once more, the longhouse settled into quiet. Outside, the northern wind rolled through the hills like an old god muttering in sleep. Not fierce warmth, not loud, just enough. And in the north, enough was everything. The night had grown thicker, curling like smoke through the thatch above, and the family huddled closer around the low hearth. Shadows danced lazily on the beams, and the fire, though quieter now, still glowed warmly over the smooth stones. Outside, the wind sang a long and distant note, like a voice calling from across the valley, or from another world entirely. Ylva, eyes reflecting the firelight, looked up at her mother. "Tell the one about Skoll again," she said softly. The wolf who chases the sun. Solveig smiled gently and nodded. She pulled the wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and began, her voice slow and smooth, the rhythm falling like gentle snow. In the time before men built homes from timber and sod, before even the gods built their halls in Asgard, there were wolves, great wolves, born not from mothers, but from night itself. Two of these wolves were Skoll and Hati, twin spirits of hunger. Skoll chased the sun across the sky, day after day, never quite catching it. His brother Hati chased the moon through the night. Their paws never touched the earth, only the edge of the sky. Ylva curled her feet under the fur, listening with solemn eyes. Rurik leaned in. "Why did they chase them?" he asked. "Because they were made to," Halvar said. "Some say Loki is their father, and that mischief flows in their blood," Solveig continued. "But others believe they were simply born with a hunger for light, and though they never caught the sun or the moon, every eclipse, that is when their teeth came closest. That is when the sky trembled." Rurik whispered, "What happens if they do catch them?" Solveig looked into the fire. "When the wolves catch the sun and moon, the sky will go dark. That is the beginning of Ragnarok, the end of this world, and the beginning of another." They all sat quietly for a moment. Even the fire seemed to hush itself, letting the thought settle. Halvar finally stirred, reaching down to tuck a warming stone beneath the sheepskin near Solveig's feet. "But we're still warm," he said simply, "and they're still chasing, so the world still turns." Rurik gave a satisfied nod, his young mind weighing gods and stones and finding balance between them. Ylva leaned her head on her mother's side. Solveig, after a long silence, added one last thought. "And sometimes they say, when a stone is hot enough, and you hold it against your chest just before sleep, you can hear Skoll's paws above the clouds." "Running?" asked Ylva. "Always running," Solveig said. The evening drifted further into stillness, as it often did after stories were told. The fire, though low, still pulsed a quiet heat, like the breath of a sleeping animal. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, light, windless flakes that stuck to the branches like spun wool. Halvar sat on a low stool near the hearth, something in his lap catching the flicker of firelight. A wedge of metal, dull at its edge but still strong, rested in his thick hands. Ylva watched from across the room. "Is that your axe?" she asked. Halvar nodded. "It's old," he said. "Made before I was born." He turned the head in his hand, letting the light glance off the worn curve of its blade. The wooden haft had been replaced many times, but the iron held the marks of the man who forged it. Shallow hammer dimples, a small maker's rune barely visible near the socket. "Did your father make it?" Rurik asked. "No, a smith in Kaupang," Halvar said with a slow reverence in his voice. "My grandfather traded 2 fine goat hides and a coil of amber beads for it. They said the smith used bog iron pulled from the marshes north of the fjord, iron that had slept in the earth for centuries." Solveig poured a thin stream of water into the wash bowl, listening as Halvar continued. His voice didn't rise or fall. It simply carried the weight of memory in the way that all such stories did. Not to excite, but to remind. The smith would have started with lumps of ore dug from the bog, Halvar explained. Dark and heavy, but not yet useful. He'd have burned them with charcoal in a low clay furnace, a bloomery. The fire must breathe like a living thing, not too fast, not too slow. Bellows made of stitched leather and wood bones, hours, sometimes days. The heat must be constant. "And then," Rurik asked, his voice hushed, "then comes the bloom, a spongy mass of metal, half-formed, full of slag and stone. The smith would pull it out glowing, hammer it flat on a great anvil, over and over, folding it, breaking off the dross, refining it into usable iron. It's loud work, bright, hot, and endless." Ylva tucked her hands beneath her knees. imagining a man working shirtless in the summer heat, blackened with soot, surrounded by sparks. Then the shaping begins, Halvar went on. He would heat the iron again, red as sunrise, and draw it out into the shape of the blade. Flat at first, wide at the end, curled back to form the socket. Some blades were welded with harder steel at the edge, brought from further south. Others were ground sharp slowly, over stone wheels. No two axes were the same. He set the old axe down beside the fire, near the warming stones. Its edge glinted like old bone. "It's not just a weapon," he added almost to himself. "It's a tool for splitting wood, for trimming rafters, for carving meat, for protection. A thing to build and a thing to end. That's why we respect it." There was a silence, not of discomfort but of understanding. Even Solveig, now running her fingers through Ylva's hair, looked over and said quietly, "Your grandfather used that axe to shape the beams of this home." Rurik looked at the axe with new eyes. No longer simply a sharp thing for battle, but a piece of history, forged in fire, handed down by hand, as much a part of the family as any story. Halvar stoked the coals a little, watching the blade catch the light again. "In winter," he said softly, "we keep the axes warm." The morning had matured quietly, like bread rising slowly near the hearth. The sun, pale and patient, pushed its way just over the tree line, laying soft light on the snow that blanketed the valley like folded wool. In the Norse village, breath rose like smoke from nostrils, and no one moved quickly unless they had to. Halvar wrapped a thick fur cloak over his shoulders. The air outside had the taste of iron and pine. Each step through the snow gave a soft, hollow crunch, the world muffled as if wrapped in silence. Beside him walked Ylva, small boots trudging with careful intention, eyes always on the white ground ahead. They followed a narrow path that led from the village edge toward the woods. It was not a path marked by fences or signs, but by the memory of footsteps and the rhythm of daily errands. Trees stood tall on either side, dark green limbs heavy with last night's snow, and the sky beyond them shimmered faintly, blue-white and washed of colour. The forest was not far. It never was. In the north, the trees are close companions, always within reach. But each step into them felt like a movement away from time itself. Here in the stillness, every sound was a message. The distant crack of an ice-split branch, a raven's croak from high above, the rustle of dry pine needles beneath the weight of snow. It was a language Halvar understood, if not fluently, then with familiarity, like an old poem heard often in childhood. Ylva suddenly paused. Her hand tugged lightly at her father's tunic. "There," she whispered. "Tracks." They crouched together beside a cluster of faint indentations in the snow, small paws delicately pressed, with a tail drag lightly furrowed behind. "A fox," Halvar murmured, "moving alone." He ran a thick finger gently over the edge of one print. "Light step. She's not afraid." Ylva stared wide-eyed. "Do you think it's a Holdu fox?" Halvar smiled, just a little. "Maybe." In the north, people told stories of foxes that were more than foxes, creatures that slipped between worlds, sometimes messengers, sometimes tricksters, sometimes spirits of ancestors walking through the snow with silent purpose. "Long ago," Halvar began, "they believed that the breath of the fox could spark flame against the sky, that when a fox spirit ran fast across the mountains, its tail brushed sparks into the heavens. That's how the lights came." Ylva looked up toward the pale winter sky, as if expecting the flicker of the aurora even in daylight. Halvar continued, his voice low and slow like a lull in the wind. "But not all fox spirits run in the sky. Some walk through our woods. Some live beneath the roots of the oldest pine where no snow ever falls. And some, they say, come close to the village in times of change." "What kind of change?" she asked. Halvar didn't answer immediately. He stood, scanning the trees, eyes narrowed but not alarmed. "When someone is about to be born," he said finally, "or when someone is going to die. Sometimes they appear at the edge of dreams, sometimes in the snow." Ylva was quiet. They moved deeper into the trees. Halvar carried a small woven basket slung over one shoulder, meant for foraged bark and dry pine resin. The snow was deeper here, but older too, dusted with brittle pine cones, the ghost of hair tracks, and the shadowy imprint of wings where some bird had landed and vanished again. The forest was not empty. It never was. But it held its secrets gently, like a grandmother cradling old letters she never read aloud. After some time, they came upon the bent pine, the tree that stood like an arch near the hollowed rock. Ylva reached out and touched the bark, running her hand along the scarred grooves where some long-gone woodpecker had tapped its rhythms. "It's here the spirits come," she said, repeating what Solveig had once told her. Halvar nodded. "This is old ground." They sat near the base of the pine, their bodies warming where the tree blocked the breeze. The light filtered down in soft beams through the branches, and Halvar began again. "There was a man, long ago," he said, "who walked alone through a storm. He was a hunter, proud and quiet, and one night in the deep snow, he found himself lost." Ylva leaned in, hugging her knees. "He wandered for hours until he saw the shape of a fox, pale as frost with eyes like black stone. It did not run from him. Instead it turned, walked a few paces, and paused, waiting." Halvar smiled faintly at the memory of the tale, passed down from his own grandfather. He followed, and the fox led him through the white woods, over snowbanks, beneath fallen trees, until he came upon his own house. He'd circled without knowing. "What did the fox do?" Ylva asked. "It vanished," Halvar said, "right where the trees began again, as if it had never been there." She thought on that a while. "Was it a Huldu fox?" she asked finally. "No one knows," Halvar answered. "But he left a bowl of warm broth at the edge of the woods every winter after that." They sat in silence a little longer, the wind curling gently between the trees, and then, slowly, they stood. Ylva gathered a few fallen pine boughs, and Halvar filled the basket with dry bark that could be crushed into kindling. The path home would be quiet. Their footprints would be the only ones on it. And far behind them, in the hush of the pines, the small fox prints would remain, slowly filling again with snow. The fire burned low that evening. It had been a day of walking, of soft words shared beneath the trees, of quiet discovery in the hush of the winter woods. Now, back inside the longhouse, the hearth's amber glow shimmered across the wooden beams. The scent of pine boughs lingered faintly, carried in with Ylva's boots and Halvar's cloak, and mixed with the more permanent smells of dried herbs, smoked meat, and earth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, not heavily but steadily, the way it does when the night wishes to be remembered. Rurik and Ylva sat cross-legged on their sleeping furs, while Solveig stirred a small pot of honeyed oats on the hearth. Occasionally she'd glance toward the entrance, as if half expecting a knock that would never come. The world was muffled behind its white veil. After a time, Halvar leaned back against a carved pillar, pipe unlit in his hands, voice slow and even. "They say snow is more than ice and sky," he began, watching the fire. "They say it's memory, that when snow falls the land remembers." The children were quiet. Solveig didn't interrupt. She'd heard this story before, but never the same way twice. "In the old times," Halvar said, "before Odin wandered the 9 worlds, before men built halls and carved runes in stone, the snow spirits moved freely. They had no name, only shape. Mist, frost, the brush of wind across your cheek when no one is near. The Norse called them vetrarvæs, winter whites, some kind, some curious, some cold in heart as they were in form. Ylva hugged her knees. "Did people see them?" she asked. "Not always," he said, "but they left signs. An extra set of prints in the snow behind you, a frozen droplet inside your mitten when your hand was dry. A feeling that you weren't quite alone." He smiled faintly. Foxes, they said, were their messengers, especially the pale ones, the ones you could only glimpse at the edge of your vision. They called them huldufoxa, hidden foxes. Ylva's eyes sparkled faintly. Some said they walked in dreams, that when you closed your eyes in the deep cold and saw a path through the woods, it was a fox who laid it there, and if you followed it, truly followed it, you would not find gold or fire or even your home again. Halvar paused. You would find your true self. The room was silent except for the soft, sticky bubble of oats boiling and the distant creak of the roof timbers settling under snow. "But if you strayed," he added, "if your heart was restless or cruel, the path would vanish, and you would wander the woods, hearing only the sound of your own breath until the snow covered your footsteps and you forgot your name." "Did it ever happen?" Rurik asked. Halvar nodded once. "Yes, or so they said. A young warrior once went into the woods to prove his strength. He mocked the fox tracks, laughed at the snow spirits. He never came back." Ylva's mouth opened slightly, but Solveig gently interjected before fear could settle. "But another story says he became a guardian spirit," she said, her voice as soft as snow falling on wool. "That he walks now beside the foxes, no longer cruel but quiet, watching, learning, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Rurik asked. "Maybe for someone to follow the path without pride," she said. The room softened again, the rhythm of the fire a lullaby in the background. Outside, a breeze moved the hanging cords of dried fish, and snowflakes kissed the wooden shutters with a barely audible hiss. Then, from Solveig, one last whisper. "The snow remembers, so we must walk gently." The snow deepened outside, building in quiet folds against the walls of the longhouse, each flake a part of the larger silence. Inside, life moved in careful rhythms, the pace of winter known by heart. There were no quick movements in winter, only deliberate ones. Fingers that moved slowly to avoid cracking skin. Feet wrapped in wool and fur, always stepping with intent. Time passed differently here, not in hours, but in small purposeful tasks that kept the cold at bay. The longhouse, though humble by modern eyes, was a marvel of warmth and design. It stood low against the landscape, its thatched roof thick with turf and snow, insulation born of centuries of necessity. The walls were made of overlapping timber beams, sometimes packed with clay or moss to fill the gaps. Nothing was wasted, nothing left to chance. A central hearth ran the length of the house, not roaring with flame, but steady and reliable, its coals managed with quiet expertise. Smoke rose upward and out through the roof hole, staining the rafters dark but drying the air as it went. The smell of peat, pine and ash lingered in the air, an earthy perfume that clung to hair and fabric. Above the fire, iron pots hung from wooden frames or chains, bubbling gently with broth, grains or thick root stews. The warmth from the fire did not heat the entire longhouse, only the middle. But that was enough if one was thoughtful. People slept with sheepskins or thick woolen blankets pulled over them, pressed together in family groups or next to walls lined with straw and hides. Even boots, often lined with rabbit fur, were kept near the hearth overnight, lest they freeze stiff by morning. Children wore tunics of tightly woven wool, often layered with cloaks. Fingers were protected by mittens crafted from felted fleece, sometimes shaped like simple bags tied at the wrist. The mittens, especially for little ones, were often passed down and mended many times. Stitches told stories too. In the sleeping corners, families laid branches of juniper or yarrow beneath their bedding. It wasn't just for the scent, though the sharp, clean smell helped mask dampness. These herbs also repelled pests and symbolized protection from illness. In this way, comfort and practicality were never far apart. Toes were warmed by hot stones, taken from the fire with wooden tongs and wrapped in thick cloth. These were nestled at the foot of the bedding, radiating heat long after the flames had quieted. Children often waited eagerly for the moment the stone was placed, still steaming faintly, as though it were a wintertime gift. By the door, thick animal hides hung like curtains, layered against the cold that threatened to slip through the seams. Snow was swept away with handmade brooms of birch twigs, and melted ice was carefully collected in wooden basins for later use. Every action was both survival and ceremony. Lanterns made of hollowed wood or horn panels glowed dimly, casting slow shadows across the beams. They were not bright, but they were warm. Everything here was warm in its own way, not blazing, but enduring. And in these pockets of warmth, stories flourished. While the fire crackled, old songs were hummed, soft and repetitive, not sung to impress, but to soothe. Sometimes there was weaving or wood carving, sometimes just the steady rhythm of someone sharpening a blade by firelight, the stone hissing faintly with each stroke. They spoke of snow as if it were alive, and in a way, it was. Snow covered the fields, but not their memory of where the path lay. It muffled the world, but did not silence it. And in winter, one listened more carefully. One noticed more. To stay warm was to stay present, to understand your firewood, how birch burned fast, how alder gave longer heat, how damp logs could betray you, to feel your home and know its creaks, to learn your body and its quiet warnings. Even the animals had their place. Goats were brought into covered stalls, cows bedded down with straw, dogs curled near the hearth, twitching in sleep, their bodies as much a part of winter survival as any crafted tool. And perhaps this was the truest warmth, the closeness, the shared breath, the recognition that comfort did not come from conquering the cold, but from meeting it with patience, preparation, and one another. Here in the snowbound north, survival was a slow art, woven into wool, etched into wood, held in stories, and passed like fire from hand to hand. The forest did not sleep in winter, only slowed. Beneath the snow-laden boughs of the pines, quiet persisted like a held breath. The air, even in morning, carried the smell of wood smoke and cold stone. But if one listened closely, truly listened, there was movement beneath the stillness, branches creaking under frost, distant caws of crows, and the occasional thud of snow falling from a limb too burdened to hold its weight. It was the season of firewood. For the Norse, fire was not simply warmth, it was life, memory, and rhythm. In these far northern lands, keeping the hearth burning was a craft of both patience and knowledge. It began not with matches or sparks, but with wood, carefully chosen, seasoned, and respected. Halvar rose early that morning, his breath clouding in the longhouse like mist. The children were still asleep, tucked against each other like curled fox kits beneath woolen cloaks. Solveig stirred faintly, pulling the fur over her shoulder with an unconscious sigh. He stepped into his boots, already stiff with cold, and opened the outer door. The leather curtain gave way with a creak. Outside, the frost painted the world in a soft silver. Each branch rhymed, each path covered. Halvar moved through the yard with slow steps, the snow crunching beneath him. He passed the stack of drying fish, the tethered sled leaning beside the goat pen, and approached the woodpile, already drawn down from the season's start. He rested a gloved hand on a log of pine, feeling the faint stickiness of dried sap near the cut. It smelled faintly of turpentine and something older, like old honey hardened by time. Pine was plentiful here, though it burned hot and fast, Birch was preferred for long, steady fires. Ash, if you could find it, was best, easy to split, and burned even when green. But Halvar knew every piece had its use. Pine started the fire, birch kept it, ash finished it. He placed the logs into the basket sled one by one. Each had been split earlier that month, the pale wood exposed like the flesh of winter fruit. No two logs the same, but each fitting into the hearth's hunger with ease. Later, the children would carry in kindling, twisted roots, bark curls, and bundles of dried twigs gathered in the dry months and stored in the loft. Rurik had become proud of his kindling knots, tying them with thin strips of gut or sinew. No smoke, just flame, he'd said with a grin the day before. Inside the longhouse, Solveig stoked the morning coals, pressing them gently with a split pine branch until the embers glowed gold again. She laid a few curls of birch bark atop the heat and whispered a short breath of thanks, not to any god in particular, but to the flame itself. In this world, fire was an old companion, demanding but loyal. They did not waste wood, nor did they hoard it. Each log, each splinter had its season. Some burned fast to boil water for morning tea. Others were saved for slow cooking, thick stews of barley, onion, or salted root vegetables. Occasionally fish or meat was smoked low over long-burning ash fires, turned gently with iron prongs. In the back corner, elder logs were used to dry clothing on frames strung with sinew or gut. The smoke softened the wool and kept moths away. It also left a smell in everything, a gentle, smoky perfume that became part of the skin and home. The children often returned smelling of smoke and pine, their cheeks pink and eyes bright. Solveig once said that scent was the memory of warmth, that when you were old and winter came, you would remember the smell of home more than anything else. Later that day, Halvar and Rurik made their way into the deeper forest. There, among the silent giants of pine and spruce, they looked for fallen limbs, not fresh dead wood, but those dried and aged by wind and frost. These were the best for clean burning, and the forest often offered them freely, as if acknowledging the quiet pact between tree and man. On the way, they found a patch of resin bleeding from a pine trunk, amber-hued and glinting like frozen honey. Halvar chipped some gently with his knife and wrapped it in cloth. Pine resin was good for many things. Mixed with charcoal and beeswax, it became pitch for sealing boats and repairing shoes. Boiled, it became medicine for wounds. Burned, it made a sweet smoke said to please the spirits. Some in the village told stories of pine trees as sacred beings, guardians of the forest who whispered with the wind. There were tales of men who carved their ancestors' faces into pine trunks so they could keep watch over the land. Others believed that pine cones carried dreams, their spiral shapes echoing the patterns of the stars. By midday, Halvar and Rurik returned with a sled half full. Not enough for the rest of winter, but a beginning. The days were short now. One did not waste the light. Back in the longhouse, Solveig had hung wet mittens near the hearth and set a kettle to boil. The air smelled of pine smoke and dried mint, both soothing in their own way. Ylva, wrapped in a grey wool shawl, sat nearby carving patterns into a soft wood block with a bone knife. She hummed quietly, something slow and circular, like a lullaby with no clear beginning or end. The fire crackled softly, each log releasing its warmth like an exhale. Smoke curled upward, painting faint trails in the air. The children leaned into the heat. The world outside was white and cold, but inside it was steady, warm, and known. And as the day faded, so too did the urgency of work. One task at a time. A log placed here, a hand warmed there, the scent of pine, the sound of breath, and the quiet gift of being alive together in the deep heart of winter. Snow fell heavier now. It came like a soft shroud over the village, thick flakes drifting silently in the air, catching on rooftops, fences, the shoulders of cloaks. The light had waned early that day. hidden behind dense clouds, and now dusk crept in like a familiar guest. The animals had gone quiet. The wind tapped gently at the shutters. Inside the longhouse, the hearth glowed low and steady. The day's last chores were done. Mittens hung drying near the smoke hole. Boots rested on their sides near the back wall, and the scent of cooked barley and sweetened mead lingered in the corners. It was the hour for stories. Ylva, the eldest, motioned for the others to gather. She sat with her back straight, hands folded neatly on her lap, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes caught the firelight and shimmered faintly. She was not the sort to waste words, not for idle chatter. But when she spoke at this hour, even the youngest children sat still. Halvar leaned back against a beam, his mug warm in his palms. Solveig brought her spindle close and nodded. Rurik and little Astrid shuffled in from the loft, blankets wrapped around them, settling into the warmth like cats. The crackling of fire was the only sound for a few moments. Then softly, almost as if speaking to the flames, Ulva began. There once lived a man named Ragnar Lothbrok. A shift in the air. An old name. One that carried weight like a sword laid gently across the knees. The children leaned closer. A man and something more than a man. A warrior, yes, a raider, a king. But before that, a boy with clever hands and hungry eyes. Born from strength raised by tales and destined, some say, by the gods themselves. Ylva's voice was quiet but firm, shaped by years of winter storytelling. She did not rush. Each word was an ember, glowing slowly. Ragnar was no ordinary warrior. His courage burned bright and reckless. It was said he slew a great serpent to win his first wife, Lagertha, fierce and golden-haired, who fought like the wind and would not bow to any man. They met in battle and she struck him across the helm. That's how their love began. Rurik's eyes widened, and Astrid giggled under her breath. He wore trousers made of fur and pitch when he killed the serpent, so thick that its venom could not pierce his skin. Some say that is why they called him Lothbrok, hairy breeches. Solveig smiled and resumed her spinning. He fathered many sons. Bjorn Ironside, who sailed farther than most would ever dream. Ivar the Boneless, clever and cruel, whose bones were said to be made of wind. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, who bore the mark of the serpent in one of his eyes, each son a legend in his own right, each one with fire in his blood. Ylva's voice slowed, her eyes drifting toward the fire, which now cast flickering shadows on the beams. But Ragnar, he sought more than gold, more than raiding and battle. He wanted to know the shape of the world, to test its edges, to look the gods in the eye. There was reverence in her tone, not worship, but something like longing. The story was not history, it was memory softened by time and snow. He sailed to Francia with a fleet that filled the sea like a black wind. He climbed the walls of Paris with rope and fury. He challenged kings, defied empires, but he did not live forever. A pause. Even the fire seemed to hush. Captured by King Ella of Northumbria, he was cast into a pit of snakes. They say he laughed, that he sang of Odin and the halls of Valhalla as the serpents bit deep, and with his dying breath he said, "Here," Ylva's voice deepened slightly, almost a whisper, how the little piglets would grunt when they heard how the old boar had died. No one spoke. Astrid clutched her blanket. Rurik stared into the fire, the glow flickering in his lashes. And his sons did hear, and they came with fire and blood, carving their vengeance into the earth. Ulva's voice softened again, drawing back from the mythic edge. But remember this. Ragnar was not a god, not really. He was a man, made of flesh and thought. He feared the sea once. He wept when his first child died. He did not always win. A log in the hearth shifted, sending a small shower of sparks into the chimney shaft. But still, he walked with the gods, or so the stories say. The room settled again. No applause, No questions, only the slow breathing of those who had listened and the steady exhale of the fire. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the longhouse in white, hiding tracks, softening edges. Inside, warmth remained, in the air, in the story, in the quiet between words. Solveig reached over and placed another log on the fire. The scent of pine sap filled the room once again, sharp and sweet. "Perhaps he walks still," Halvar said almost absently. Ylva gave a knowing smile. "If he does, he walks the snow-covered paths between the stars." Eric walked with care. The eldest son of the household, now nearly a man in truth, though his beard still came in uneven and patchy. His father had risen early to light the hearth and begin preparing the morning tasks. But this, the checking of the ice and the lines beneath it, had been passed to Eric over the past year. A responsibility, a quiet one. The sort of work not watched closely, but quietly measured. The path to the fjord wound between stands of fir, brittle and dark in the cold. His boots crunched softly on the top crust of snow. He could smell the cold, that sharp metallic scent of ice and pine, and somewhere faint beneath it, the lingering smell of the sea, muffled by snow but never entirely gone. The fjord stretched before him, a wide, flat plain of pale blue-grey, wrapped in snow at the banks and layered in thick frozen silence. The ice glistened like glass in some places, dulled in others by dustings of powder blown by the wind. He came to a spot where the line had been dropped the day before. A small wooden stake, marked with an old carving, protruded from the snow like a frozen finger. He knelt carefully, brushed away the snow from the ice hole with his mittens and peered down. The hole was small, no larger than a man's helmet, rimmed with smoothed ice and frost. Beneath it, shadows, dark and slow, moved beneath the surface. The net beneath the ice would hold something, perhaps. Perhaps not. It depended on the spirits of the water, some said. On the way you tied your knots, others claimed. On how respectfully you greeted the river before you began. Eric reached down slowly, tugging on the wooden handle affixed to the net rope. It groaned a little in the cold as the ice shifted. Slowly, slowly, the net emerged. Wet, heavy, glistening. A single fish, small, gleaming silver, enough for a meal. He gave a small nod to the air, not quite a smile, but something close. Then he saw the mark in the snow just a few steps beyond the hole. A thin impression, the shape of a foot, barely pressed, almost already gone in the shifting light. His breath caught, but not from fear, more from familiarity. He knew this shape, or rather, he remembered it, from a different winter. He had been smaller then, perhaps 10 winters old. A bold child, foolish and light on his feet. He had dared himself too far onto the frozen edge, where the ice near the rocks grew thin, where the sound beneath one's boots changed, from crisp and solid to hollow and echoing. He had slipped through. The cold was not pain at first. It was silence. A stunned, blank nothingness that swallowed sound and breath alike. He had been beneath for only seconds, he was told later. A neighbour had seen, hauled him up by the hood of his cloak. But in those moments, beneath the ice, time had changed. There had been light, strange and silver, filtering through the pane of ice above, bubbles drifting upward like lost thoughts, the press of water on all sides, and a feeling, not of drowning, but of being seen. He did not tell anyone that, not even his father. Only now, years later, looking at that place again, could he almost admit it to himself. He looked out across the frozen fjord. The wind had picked up, only slightly, but enough to carry sound more easily. The distant call of a raven overhead, the creak of a pine bough behind him. And still, the ice held. He pulled the net carefully back into place, folding it under the water's surface, marking the hole again with the stake. His gloves were soaked through now. His fingers stung. He stood. Before leaving, he paused and muttered an old phrase under his breath. A charm, almost. Something half remembered from his grandmother. The words were simple: a thanks to the river, an offering of breath given back to the air. Superstition? Perhaps. But there were many things not explained by logic alone in the north. Like why some men fell through the ice and others did not. Why the fish came on some days and swam away on others. Why in dreams the river sometimes spoke. He turned to go. Behind him, the mark in the snow had already begun to fade. As Eirik made his way back up the trail, a slow wind stirring the drifts beside him, his mind wandered. Not forward, to chores or words awaiting him at home, but backward, into the folds of memory and stories once told around the hearth, or whispered under breath during long walks like these. There was one story in particular he always thought of when he came down to the ice. It was one his grandmother used to tell softly, as though not wanting to wake something sleeping. She spoke of the Allagabrenner, the riverbines, unseen spirits of the water that dwelled in the deep pools and slow eddies beneath the surface. Not wicked, she said, not like trolls or Draugr, but patient, quiet, capricious. They watched men who came to fish. They measured their steps, their voices, their respect. Some they favoured, giving them fish even in lean winters, guiding their nets gently along the undercurrents. Others they tested. A careless word, a shouted boast, a footfall too bold on the wrong patch of ice, and the river would remember. And at the heart of all water, it was said, waited Njord, the god who lived not in the stormy sea, but in its peaceful breath, who walked in the hush between waves and snow, in the quiet lap of water against stone. Njord, father of winds that did not howl but whispered. He was not often called upon in the heart of winter. His realm was the sea, the shore, the long sails of summer voyages. But here, at the frozen fjord, some said you could still feel him. His touch was not warm, nor was it cruel. It was inevitable. There was a tale that once, in the days of the sagas, a fisherman lost beneath the ice had seen Njord's hall. Not in fire and gold, like Odin's, but in stillness. A great longhouse beneath the fjord, lit with the glow of moonstone and glassy ice. Its beams made of driftwood, its roof tiled with old ship planks and whalebone. The fisherman said he was offered a drink, not of mead, but of salt water, and when he drank it, he woke gasping beside the hole in the ice, alive. That fisherman never returned to the fjord again. He took to walking inland, farming, growing barley, even though he was poor at it. And when people asked him why, he would only shake his head and say, "I've already seen what waits below." Eirik did not believe all of it, of course, but still, he did as his grandmother taught. He never spat near the river, nor shouted at it, nor took its silence for granted. When he returned to the village that morning, the frost clinging to his cloak and the scent of brine still lingering in his gloves, he paused for just a moment before stepping over the threshold. He looked back toward the fjord, the ice flat and distant now in the early light, and he whispered a small word. Not a prayer, not exactly, just a thank you. For the fish, for the story, for the memory of hands pulling him up into the sun years ago, when the water had almost kept him. The longhouse held the heat like an old promise. By mid-morning, the central fire had burned into a slow amber heart. The smoke drifted lazily toward the hole in the roof, softened by the thatch and frost, spiraling like a thought that hadn't settled yet. The scent of burning birch, damp wool and dried herbs braided together in the stillness. At the far end of the room, beneath low beams polished smooth by generations of hands and smoke, the women had gathered with baskets and bundles of wool at their feet. They sat wrapped in layers, shawls worn thin at the edges, cloaks patched with memories, hems stitched with stories only they would remember. Their hands were busy, always busy. Theirs was not the work of great adventure or battles or the building of ships. Theirs was the steady stitching of life together, one careful loop at a time. Ingrid, the eldest among them now since her mother had passed 2 winters before, sat nearest the fire. Her spindle spun with an easy rhythm, like the turn of stars in the sky, slow, deliberate, unceasing. The wool slipped between her fingers, clean and carded, the colour of mist over stone. To her left, Freydis was mending a tunic. Her youngest sons, judging by the way she muttered about fraying seams and the never-ending holes he wore into his sleeves. She grumbled, but her fingers worked gently, smoothing the fabric with every pass of her needle. And beside her, Asa, younger than the others, but with a calmness that made her seem older. She was quiet now, winding yarn into a ball, but the small twitch of her mouth said she was listening closely, as always. They spoke as they worked, the way one breathes, not hurried, not with purpose, but because silence was only needed in grief or prayer. "You remember the baby last spring?" Freydis said, not looking up. "The one born with a red curl at the crown?" Ingrid nodded. "Helga's girl. She's been smiling in her sleep, always in her sleep. My cousin says that means she dreams of her past life still." There were soft chuckles. "Or perhaps she's laughing at what's ahead of her," Asa said dryly. Laughter stirred among them like leaves shifting in wind. It wasn't loud, but it was warm. Stories came slowly, as they always did when wool was being worked. One spun thread while another unravelled memory. There were tales of dreams, the kind that lingered like wood smoke. A crow landing on the roof just after dawn. A hare crossing one's path to the river. Birthmarks shaped like runes. The women did not always agree on what signs meant, but they did not dismiss them either. Interpretation was part of the weaving. Asa, it turned out, had dreamt of water the night before. "I was standing in a stream," she said, "but the water flowed both ways. I tried to fill my hands, but every time I lifted them, the water turned to snow and blew away." "Loss," Freydis murmured. "No," Ingrid said, eyes not leaving her spinning. "Not loss. Change. Water running backward means a message is trying to reach you, one that doesn't follow time." Asa tilted her head, considering. "And the snow?" "That," Ingrid smiled, "means you'll forget it by tomorrow." Again, quiet laughter. It settled in the corners of the room like warmth. This was not the laughter of jokes, but the laughter of shared language, of years spent together in the hush between days. Behind them, a girl no more than 10 winters old was carding wool clumsily. Her fingers were small, still unaccustomed to the tug and sweep of the brushes. She looked up wide-eyed, as if waiting for someone to speak directly to her. No one did, but they included her all the same, simply by continuing. Mending, spinning, weaving. These were more than chores. They were memory made useful. Every patch stitched into a tunic told a story, of the boy who grew faster than the seasons, of the brother who returned from a raid with one sleeve burned off, of the daughter who carved a pattern into her apron hem with a fishbone and insisted it was a rune for good dreams. Thread passed from hand to hand. Dye from crushed berries or roots stained the wool's soft hues, dusky purple from elderberry, green from nettle, golden tones from onion skin. Each colour meant something, not just for decoration, but for mood, for purpose, for memory. In a lull, Asa spoke again. "Do you think the Norns spin wool like this?" Ingrid looked over her spindle. "They spin fate, child, not wool. But maybe it feels the same." The room paused a moment. Ingrid considered. "Perhaps. Though I don't think they complain about sore fingers or dropped stitches." Asa smiled. "Maybe they do, and no one hears it." There was more laughter then. Real, full. The child carding wool giggled and nearly dropped her brushes. Someone handed her a dried apple slice to quiet the sound. Outside, the snow whispered along the roof. The light from the fire flickered gently across the women's faces, highlighting the lines near their eyes, the curve of a cheek, the edge of a scar, each face a small map, each hand part of a lineage older than memory. Time was strange in the longhouse. The fire, the wool, the rhythm of breath. They folded it inwards until hours became moments, and moments stretched like spun thread. By the time a meal was ready, broth and grain thickened from the pot that had hung quietly over the fire all morning. The mending had been done, a tunic patched, a blanket hemmed, yarn dyed and twisted, but more than that, words had been mended too. The memory of a dream re-examined, a grief named without fanfare, a fear folded gently between one stitch and the next, and in that way, the longhouse held not just heat, but history. Not as saga, not as song, but as the quiet labour of hands that knew winter and chose to soften it, one thread at a time. The path to the seer's hut was not one that most took lightly, even though it wound no more than a half hour beyond the edge of the village. It began behind the smokehouse, past the bare birch grove where the wind sighed low through the bones of the trees. The trail was narrow, sometimes fading beneath the snow, sometimes swallowed by brambles. Yet everyone in the village knew the way by heart, even those who swore they had never walked it. They had, in dreams or in stories. Today the path was taken by Kari. She carried a bundle of dried herbs tied with cord, meadowsweet, mugwort, angelica root, a gift, not payment. The seer did not accept coin nor trade, but herbs were welcome, especially those harvested at the proper time, dried with care, wrapped in silence. Kari had not spoken since leaving the village. There was no need. The woods required silence to speak. The snow crunched beneath her boots, not soft, not yet, but brittle from last night's freeze. Crows watched her from above, their feathers puffed against the cold. One let out a single call as she passed, but she did not turn her head. She knew the superstition. If the crow calls once, it is watching. If twice, it warns. If 3 times, the spirits are near. But only one cry came. She took it as a good sign. As she walked, she thought of the seer and how no one knew her age. Some said she had lived in the woods since before Kari's grandfather was born. Others said she had arrived suddenly one winter, and no one had dared to ask from where. Her hut stood in the shelter of a crooked pine, bent low from a storm no one remembered. Moss and smoke had blackened the beams. Charms of bone and copper hung from the eaves, clicking gently when the wind touched them, not like chimes, but like the ticking of a great slow clock. Kari approached without rush. She paused at the low fence of woven branches. She waited. Not long, just long enough to be acknowledged by the place. Then she stepped through and knelt by the doorway, placing the herb bundle on a flat stone beside a carved antler. A voice, old as lichen, spoke from inside. "Come in, child." Kari ducked beneath the lintel. The hut was low, warmer than she expected, and dim with a reddish light from the fire pit in the centre. Smoke curled toward a hole in the roof, but not all of it escaped. The air smelled of pine resin, ash, dried herbs, and something older, like the inside of a story. The seer sat wrapped in wool so layered it was hard to see where fabric ended and skin began. Her hair was grey, thick, and bound in braids. Her eyes, milky with age, seemed not to look at Kari, but through her. She did not greet her with questions. She did not ask why Kari had come. Instead, she gestured to the stool near the hearth. Kari sat. The fire cracked, resin popped. A bundle of dried leaves hung above the flames, hissing gently as they gave up their scent. Kari recognized yarrow and juniper. The seer lifted a bone from a pouch beside her. It was carved, polished, and old. She turned it once in her hand, then placed it between them. Still, No words. Finally, after several long minutes of silence, the seer spoke. "You carry worry in your back." Kari blinked. She had not mentioned anything, but it was true. The ache had been there since midwinter, low and deep, waking her before the sun. The seer took a handful of powder from a small leather pouch and tossed it into the fire. It flared blue for a moment, then settled. "Dreams?" Kari nodded. "Of water. Deep. I'm walking through it, but I don't leave footprints, and someone is calling, but I can't hear what they say." The seer reached into a second pouch and drew out 3 stones. Runes. She turned them in her hands, then cast them gently onto a square of worn wool. Kari leaned forward, heart quiet. One rune faced up. Laguz, the water rune. Another fell halfway into a fold. Raido, the journey. And the last, lying upside down. Ansuz, the god rune, inverted. The seer nodded slowly. "You are not where you were meant to be," she said. "But it is not wrong, only unfinished." Kari waited. "The gods do not shout," the seer said. "They whisper through dream, and often we are too loud to hear. You must be quieter." Kari lowered her eyes, folding her hands in her lap. "And the water? It is asking you to listen." They sat in silence again, and the fire softened. The smoke no longer stung the eyes. It comforted. The air felt dense with meaning, though none of it could be put into words. The seer reached for Kari's hands, rough with wool work, calloused from wood. She turned them over gently, like leaves. "You dream like your grandmother." Kari looked up, startled. "You knew her?" "I knew her silence." The wind pressed against the walls of the hut then, not loud, but present. The bone charms clicked once more, like a sigh of agreement. Kari rose after some time. The seer did not ask her to stay, nor to go. When Kari turned toward the door, she paused. "What should I do?" The seer's voice was almost a whisper. "Boil meadow sweet with honey and drink before you sleep. Walk slow for 3 days, speak little, and if the crows call 3 times, you come back." Kari nodded, and then she stepped back into the snow. The world was quieter than before. The trees seemed taller, the snow deeper. The crow did not cry. But far off, past the bend in the trail, she thought she saw a shadow move among the trees. Not threatening, just there, as if walking the same way she was. A shape half seen, like something remembered before it was ever known. She did not look twice. Instead, she walked the path back to the village with the weight of omens pressed gently against her shoulders. Not heavy, not painful, just real. The snow was softer now. The wind that had stirred the birch trees earlier had quieted, tucking itself into the folds of the landscape like a creature going to sleep. Kari's steps left deep prints this time, her boots finding the familiar creak of snow warming just slightly in the afternoon hush. The village came into view slowly, not with a sudden clearing, but like a woven cloth becoming visible one thread at a time. Smoke curled from the longhouse roofs. A goat bleated somewhere unseen. A child's laughter rang once, then vanished, as if caught in wool. Kari paused at the crest of the rise before the outer fence. Her fingers brushed the charm of wool and small stones that hung from her belt. A small piece of home she carried for luck. Her breath came slowly, and she exhaled into the sky, watching it drift. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. The seer's words weren't instructions, not in the way one follows steps. They were textures, directions for the spirit. Kari felt it even now, a low humming in her chest, like a thread had been tugged gently, and now she must follow where it leads. As she stepped into the village, no one stopped her. That was the way of it. One did not come back from the woods to questions. One returned, and one was watched quietly, and only spoken to when the silence had had its say. She passed Inga, the weaver, who gave her a brief glance and then turned back to her basket of spun flax. The glance was enough, not a question but a recognition, a shared knowledge of what it meant to walk alone to the seer's hut. At the threshold of the longhouse, Carrie hesitated. She could hear the rustle of the fire being tended and the soft murmur of her younger brother speaking to himself as he carved. Home, in all its warmth and ordinariness. Inside it smelled of smoke, wool, and dried fish. Her mother was seated on the low bench, mending a seam with her head bowed and her lips moving faintly in thought. Carrie stepped inside. Her brother looked up first. His eyes widened a little, perhaps at something he noticed in her face, but he said nothing. Their mother looked up next, blinking once, thread still looped through her fingers. Carrie nodded once. "I'm back." The words felt heavy in her mouth, not sorrowful, not tired, just full. Her mother did not speak, but patted the bench beside her. Carrie sat. The warmth of the hearth seeped into her knees. No one asked what the seer had said, not yet, and she was grateful. The fire crackled quietly. The walls of the longhouse held in the dusk like arms folded gently around the day. Somewhere behind her the door closed softly, and the house exhaled. The first sound was the rhythmic shock of the sled's runners on packed snow. Soft, steady, far off. It reached the village before the sled itself did, long before any voice called out or any shape appeared between the snow-laden pines. Those indoors heard it and said nothing, their hands pausing for just a moment before continuing their work. Visitors were coming, not raiders, not messengers, not merchants, just neighbours, close enough to walk, distant enough to still bring news. By the time the sled reached the outer fence, the family by the gate had already opened the way. There were no formal greetings, no horns, no songs, just a nod, a still glance, and the silent language of people who knew the weight of winter. The sled was narrow, drawn by a single shaggy pony with ice in its mane. Behind it walked 3 people, the head of the family, his eldest son, and a girl of perhaps 12, her cheeks red with cold, her hand gripping a bundle wrapped in hide. They came from the ridge settlement, a day's walk in good weather, 2 days in snow. No one asked why they came. In winter, all visits held purpose, and all purposes were welcome. The trading took place not with raised voices or barter haggling, but with calm, deliberate gestures beside the longhouse fire. Words were few. A hand unwrapped a roll of dried fish, firm and clean. Another hand laid out carved bone hooks, smoothed, shaped with care, etched with small protective runes. Carrie watched from her place near the wall, quiet as the fire. Her mother knelt nearby, ladling broth into wooden bowls. One for each guest, one for each member of the household. The aroma of fish stock, onions, and horseradish filled the air, rising into the beams like a kind blessing. A bowl was passed to the visitors. This, more than the trade, marked the ritual. Hospitality was sacred. The gods themselves could walk the land in the shape of a traveller. Odin, the wanderer, was said to appear with a hood low over his eye, testing the hearts of hosts. Denying a guest warmth or food was not only cruel, it was dangerous. The visitors accepted the bowls with quiet nods. The youngest, the girl with the wrapped bundle, caught Carrie's eye across the hearth and gave the smallest of smiles. Carrie smiled back, not broadly, not boldly, just enough to return the warmth. The 2 families ate in silence, punctuated by the soft clink of spoons on wood and the muted crackle of fire. Behind the visitors, the wind pushed gently against the walls, reminding them all that outside the fire's circle, winter still ruled. After the meal, small gifts were exchanged. Not trade, gifts. A carved whistle for the child, a twist of birch bark soaked in resin, a comb made from antler. These were not necessities. They were offerings of connection, pieces of the giver's craft, the giver's day, the giver's winter. The head of the visiting family stood, wiping his hands on his tunic. "No one hungry?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. The others shook their heads, some with a smile. He nodded. "Then the road is good." This too was part of the rite. Words, when they came, were sparse but meaningful. He looked to the fire. "Ice is thick on the river. Nets caught good this week. But foxes follow our tracks. My son saw 3. The oldest son, seated cross-legged, added, "One was white." That meant something. White animals were omens. Some said they were the eyes of gods. Some said they were spirits of the snow itself, unbound and watching. Whether the sight was good or ill depended on the story and the storyteller. Carrie's father, silent until then, lifted his gaze from the bone hook he'd been studying. "Did it look back?" The visitor's son nodded. It watched. And then no more was said about it. Not here. Not while the fire burned and food still sat half-eaten. Some stories belonged to the forest. The girl stood now, shy but composed. She stepped forward, unwrapping the bundles she had carried. Inside were small items clearly crafted with care. Dyed threads, 2 wooden needle cases, a piece of dried rowan with a carving of a bear. She extended them to Carrie. Carrie blinked, startled. The girl gave no explanation. Gifts didn't require them. But her eyes were kind and her posture calm. Carrie reached out and accepted them with both hands, as was proper. "Thank you," she whispered. The girl nodded, then returned to her father's side. When the guests prepared to leave, no one rushed. Layers were tied slowly, boots stamped, fur hoods pulled low. The sled's harness adjusted with practiced movements. The fire was fed a little more, out of respect, as they stepped outside. Smoke and warmth followed them into the cold. At the edge of the village, they turned back briefly. One hand lifted in farewell, not high, not waving, just a small sign that the visit had ended well. No feast, no speeches, just shared broth, a trade of fish and craft, and a silent acknowledgement that through winter's hush, the thread between people still held. Inside the longhouse, Carrie turned the needle case in her hands. The carving was simple. A fox, its tail curled, sleeping. "White," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Her father nodded without looking up. "It remembers." And that was all. The longhouse creaks, someone hums an old song. Ice groans in the trees, a shared lullaby. The fire had quieted. Its light no longer danced boldly on the beams, but pooled low in the hearth like a glowing animal curled to sleep. Shadows stretched long across the packed earth floor, mingling with the silence that began to settle over the longhouse like falling snow. Night in winter was not a sudden thing. It crept in through the roof poles and the corners of the room, pressing gently against the breath of those inside. The day's tasks were long done. The broth pot scraped clean, the tools tucked beneath furs, the door latched softly against the wind. Kari lay near the far wall, a rough-spun wool blanket drawn to her chin, the fox-carved needle case tucked beside her for comfort. Her brother slept already, one arm across his brow, the other curled around a wooden figure he refused to part with. Above them, the rafters groaned. The weight of snow shifted slowly, as if the roof itself were dreaming. Here and there, the dry wood gave a cracking pop that echoed down through the timbers. No one stirred. These were familiar sounds, not warnings, but reminders that the world outside was heavy with cold and that the longhouse held. A voice began to hum. Low, worn, feminine. It came from the centre of the room, Carrie's mother. She sat upright still, combing her fingers through a skein of carded wool. The humming was barely there, but it threaded through the room like smoke. It was not a full song, not yet, just fragments of melody, older than memory, stitched from the voices of women long gone. Kari did not know all the words, though she'd heard them since she was small. The songs changed over time, moulded by voice and place. No one had ever written them down. They passed like fire between generations, not for performance, but for warmth. Sleep now, stone of my stone, where frost cannot follow. Moon above the fjord is thin and the tree spirits hollow. A breath and then another verse. Lay your bones where kin have laid, where the gods breathe low and old. Night will hold you in her braid, silver-threaded, still and cold. Outside the trees replied, not with voices, but with the deep groan of ice pulling at their bark. Far off, the cracking of a frozen trunk echoed through the woods like a god stretching in the dark. No one flinched. The sound was part of the world's sleep, vast, slow and indifferent. In the loft above the hearth, the old aunt turned onto her side, her joints popping quietly beneath her blankets. She added her voice, hoarse and slow, to the lullaby, like another ember catching. Kari's father, who rarely sang, hummed just 2 notes from his low place near the door. Barely a breath of sound, enough to mean, I am here too. In Norse homes of the time, sleep was shared not only for warmth, but for survival. Bodies pressed together beneath hides and blankets, forming one long shape of life against the cold. Dreams were close. The breath of others rhythmically reminded each sleeper, you are not alone. Privacy was not a word they used, but neither was loneliness. In the dark, everyone belonged to everyone else. Near the wall, the baby from the younger family stirred and whimpered. His mother shifted, pulled him close, and whispered the lullaby again, only the last 2 lines this time, gently repeated until the sound and the rocking carried him under. Stories, too, were told like this, soft and unfinished, passed between waking and sleep. One of the children, in a dozing voice, murmured, "Tell me again, of the fire in the sea." The old aunt answered, eyes half shut, her tone dreamy, already folding into sleep. It is said that deep below, where the gods once shaped the earth, there is a great fire that burns beneath the fjord. It's not hot, not anymore. But on the longest night, if you are still very still, you can feel it hum in the bones of the mountain. No one asked if it was true. It didn't matter. That was never what stories were for. Near midnight, a draught crept in from the edge of the doorframe. Someone shifted and placed another log on the fire, moving slowly to keep the peace of the room. The sparks flared and then settled. Kari, still awake, looked toward the beams above her. They seemed to breathe with the night. The house, after all, was not just a building. It was a body. Its bones creaked, its heart glowed, and here within its chest the family slept, carried through the hours like cargo across a black sea. One final verse, spoken rather than sung, drifted across the room. Stone sleeps beside stone, and the gods, they do not wake. Silence again. Just the wind slipping past the eaves, the soft warmth of breath, and the snow thickening outside. And so the longhouse slept. The air was still. Outside the longhouse, frost clung to the bark of trees like spider silk, and the moon had long since disappeared beyond the ridge line. The sky, ink dark and vast, carried with it a cold so deep and quiet that the sound of a boot stepping onto snow might have woken the world. Kari was not sleeping. She had risen with the breath of dream still clinging to her, and tiptoed through the sleeping forms of her kin, stepping over fur-wrapped legs and the ash-soft edge of the hearth. Her tunic was too thin for the cold, but she didn't mind. Something had tugged her gently to the door. She found her father already outside. He was leaning on the old post, wrapped in his winter cloak, his eyes tilted skyward. His axe hung silent on his belt, untouched. Snow crunched softly beneath him as he shifted, and the light from the sky gave his figure the shape of a carving. He did not look down at her, but opened his arm, and Carrie stepped beside him into the curl of warmth. They stood that way for a while. The stars above them were bright and slow, and the sky had the kind of silence that made a child feel very small. "Which one is hers?" she asked softly. Her father tilted his head just slightly. "Whose?" "Sif," Carrie said. "Or Frigg. Or the one with the hair like grain." He nodded. "That one, maybe," he said, pointing to a cluster of stars near the edge of the horizon. "Or maybe she doesn't stay still. Maybe she moves." Carrie frowned. "The stars move?" "They turn," he said, "with the world, slowly, like a yoke, like the sea pulls at the land." Carrie nestled against him. "Then how do you know where things are?" A smile, faint and invisible in the dark. "You don't, not always. That's what makes them stories." She paused, then asked, not quite casually, though she tried, "Is that where Jormungandr is?" He turned his eyes upward again. "No," he said, "not in the sky. He is below us, in the sea that circles everything. They say his body wraps all the way around the world, biting his own tail. His coils make the oceans rise and fall. When he shifts, the tide changes. When he sleeps, the sea is calm. And when he wakes..." He didn't finish. Carrie leaned her head on his side. "When he wakes, that's when it ends?" Her father nodded slowly. "Yes, when he lets go of his tail." The wind picked up, brushing the trees like soft whispering fingers. "But not now," he added gently. "Not tonight." She looked up again. "Is he bad?" Her father took a long time before answering. "He is not good. Not bad, he just is. That's what makes him part of the end." She blinked at the stars. "So the end is already there?" "Always," he said. "Always waiting, but not rushing, not yet." Above them a star flickered, a line of light across the black, brief and cold. "Like fire and ice?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, that's how it ends. First the fire from deep within the earth, then the ice when the sun vanishes. It is said the sky will split, and the wolves will catch the moon. Jormungandr will rise, and Thor will meet him. They will destroy each other." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. "Because," he said at last, "some things are too large to last." They stood in silence for a long time. Carrie felt the weight of the sky, the hush of the dark, the breath of her father. She watched the stars and tried to imagine a serpent so large that he could circle the world. She tried to picture Thor, massive and shining, facing him in battle, but it felt far away, like something told across many winters, never meant to be touched. "Is it sad?" she asked. Her father looked down at her. "The end?" She nodded. He knelt slowly, his joints stiff from the cold. His hands found her shoulders, and his eyes were soft, even in the pale starlight. "No," he said. "It's a story, just like the stars. It'll come, but only when the tale is ready to be finished." He touched her forehead lightly. "And you, little fox, are in the middle of it, not the end." She smiled, sleepy now, the cold tugging gently at her. He lifted her in his arms and carried her back toward the door of the longhouse. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and above them the stars turned slowly, endlessly. Just before the door closed behind them, Kari whispered, "I think Jormungandr must be lonely." Her father paused. "He may be, but he still holds on," she murmured, eyes drifting shut. "Yes," he said, kissing the crown of her head. "He still holds on." And with that, the door shut quietly, the stars slipped away, and the longhouse returned to the hush of early dawn. The storm had settled in for the day. The sky beyond the thick wool-covered openings of the longhouse was the colour of old milk, opaque, quiet, and without shadow. Snow fell steadily, though gently, and the hush of it filled every crevice of the dwelling. Inside, the air was warmer, curled with smoke from the hearth and smelling faintly of peat, iron, and boiled lichen broth. No one would venture far today. It was a day of hands and stories. The long bench along the wall had been cleared of last night's cloaks, now hanging stiff near the fire to dry. A length of bone had been soaked overnight in warm ash water, and now sat waiting on a small plank of wood near the feet of Halldor, the middle son. His blade, dulled at the tip and sharp along one edge, moved slowly. Each draw of it revealed the creamy curve of the bone beneath, coaxing it toward the shape of a comb. The bone, from a sheep that had died in late summer, had been cleaned and dried since the leaves turned gold. Everything was used. Even the smallest, thinnest piece had purpose. Awls, knitting needles, pins. Halldor carved in silence, and beside him, Freydis, smaller, more precise in her movements, worked on a needle case, the thin shaft already polished to a dull shine. On the hearthstone, the grandmother sat. Her knees were covered in thick wraps of wool, and her back was bent, but her voice was clear, worn like the handle of a favourite tool. Her fingers no longer carved as well, but they held the combs with knowledge, with memory. She ran one thumb along the spine of an older piece, one carved by her own brother, long gone to the ground beneath the stones. "This one here," she said, her voice weaving gently through the crackle of the fire, "was made the winter your great-uncle saw the spirit of a mare in the snow." The children did not look up, but they listened. Always they listened. She stood at the edge of the trees, eyes like coals. No breath came from her, not even in the cold, just the shape of her body, as pale as old milk and too still to be alive. And he, fool that he was, he followed. Freydis's blade paused. He was lost a full night, said the tracks never faded, that every time he stepped forward she stepped further, but the snow never filled in her path. When he finally came home, he'd carved a charm from a bit of driftwood and wore it for the rest of his life. Halldor exhaled softly through his nose, just once. "Did it work?" he asked, not looking up. The grandmother nodded. He never saw her again, but he never whistled in the dark after that, not even to call a dog. She leaned forward to put another split log into the fire. The ash puffed upward and caught the light like powdered silver. Outside, the snow deepened. The world was white and without shape. Inside, the longhouse smelled of wet wool and smoke and bone. The grandmother picked up another comb. This one was older, much older, worn at the edges and carved with a pattern of small spiral dots. "This was from the village before this one," she said, quieter now. "The one near the stone with the runes." Freydis looked up. "Before the fire?" she asked. A nod. "Yes, before that, before we moved inland." She held the comb in her lap and ran a soft piece of leather along its edge, polishing it. "They say that back then," she began, "in the older winters the snow came harder and the light stayed gone longer. But they also say the spirits were closer to the fire then, that the veil was not so thick." Halldor tilted his head. "You believe that?" Her eyes, grey and blinking slowly, met his. "I've lived long enough to know that believing isn't the same as knowing. But I've also lived long enough to know that things live at the edge of our sight. Things we don't have names for anymore." She smiled. "That's why we carve the patterns the way we do. These here," she held up the comb, "aren't just pretty. They hold the shape of the world, the order we place over the dark." There was a pause then, a soft silence. The fire hissed. The snow tapped at the wood of the door. Freydis whispered, "Will the snow ever stop?" The grandmother looked at her. Her smile didn't fade. "It always does," she said. "Even the longest storm ends, even in the oldest tales." and then the world is new again. She motioned to a bag near her feet, small, stitched from sealskin and softened with years. Freydis reached for it, drawing out a thin, polished disc of antler. The top had a design etched into it, a line curling like a snake, a small figure holding a spear, and above it, a star. "What's this one?" Freydis asked. "That," said the grandmother, "is an old one, older than me, from the west coast, where the salt eats the wood and the wind speaks louder than the trees. It's a charm for night travelers. You hang it on the wall near the bed and it keeps the restless dreams away." "Does it work?" Halldor asked. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes the dreams need to come, and sometimes they need to be kept out." They worked until the light shifted. By afternoon, the smell of porridge and dried berries filled the longhouse, and outside, the snow had deepened another handspan. The winds picked up, whistling soft tunes through the slats and poles, and the grandmother, now wrapped more tightly in furs, leaned back against the post and closed her eyes. Halldor continued carving, gentler now. Freydis polished the needle case until her reflection almost peered back. The tools of the past, shaped by the hands of the present, carried more than function. They carried memory. And the voices of the old did not fade. Not here. Not on days like these when the storm spoke softly and the fire listened. As the fire settled and the snow thickened outside, the old woman's voice lifted again, soft, like a memory. "Do you know," she began, smoothing a woven cloth in her lap, "there was once a time when Thor's hammer went missing." Freydis glanced up, eyes wide. Halldor paused his carving. "They say it was stolen by Thrym, a frost giant, bold and cold-hearted, who buried it beneath the earth and demanded Freya's hand in marriage to return it." The children frowned. "Freya didn't marry him, did she?" The old woman smiled, slow and secret. "No." Loki, as quick of tongue as ever, whispered a plan. Thor would wear a bridal veil, pretend to be Freya, and so he did, fuming beneath fine linen and jewels, while the giants feasted and laughed. She leaned closer to the hearth, voice lowered. They grew suspicious when Freya ate an ox, ate salmon, and drank mead from a cauldron. But Loki soothed them. "She was fasting with excitement," he said. And then they brought out Mjolnir to bless the wedding, laid it on Thor's lap. He seized it, tore off the veil, and with one blow shattered the hall. The tale ended like a breath. The fire snapped. "That's why," she added, "we carve his hammer on doors, on pendants, not just for war, for protection, for keeping the dark outside." Freydis looked down at her own carving, tracing a shape, a small hammer, into the edge of bone. The long night of winter was not over. Snow still lined the earth like a heavy quilt, and the sky remained pale and quiet, reluctant to brighten. But in the early morning, before the children stirred, before the boots were pulled on, before the day's tasks were named, there was a change. It began with the smoke, not the sharp, stinging smoke of wet wood or thick pine, but a gentler scent, a wisp that curled above the roof, pale and blue against the grey morning. Carrie noticed it first as she pushed aside the heavy felt at the door. The air met her with its usual bite, but something had shifted. The scent of cold was not as deep. It carried the faintest trace of Thor. Not warmth, not yet, but the promise of it. Inside, the longhouse held its hush. The fire, now mostly coals, glowed soft and low. Someone stirred it gently, easing kindling into its embers. The crackle was a familiar sound, the same sound that had filled this space every morning of winter. And yet, today, it echoed a little differently. Around the hearth, the daily rhythm resumed. A pot was lifted, mittens were warmed. The youngest child crawled from under pelts, hair wild, eyes squinting at the light. It was not a special day. There was still mending to do, traps to check, broth to stretch into a full meal, but voices were just a touch lighter, and when someone opened the hatch to the cold air, no one shuddered. Joran sat at his usual place, boots half laced, watching the roof beams breathe gently with the shifting warmth. He didn't speak. He simply took in the sound of wind that didn't howl. He listened to the wood as it settled, not cracked from the cold but eased. Outside a raven called, high and clear like a note struck on something old. Freydis ran her fingers through her braid, then busied herself near the back wall, turning a fur inside out, checking for wear. As she worked, she hummed, not a lullaby this time, but a simple tune. A weaving rhythm, something she had heard from her mother, and her mother before that. And there, near the hearth, the grandmother dozed, her hands still curled around an unfinished comb. She had told her stories, of gods and giants, of warmth and protection, of spirits in the snow. Now she rested, her breath light and even, rising and falling like the smoke curling through the rafters. In the silence that followed, the fire spoke for them all, crackling softly, patiently. The family, this winter village, this world tucked in snow, had endured another night. That was enough. More than enough, and in the lightest hush of wind, too faint to be called a breeze, something whispered of spring, of meltwater beneath the ice, of green hiding far beneath the frost, of birds not yet seen but remembered. Carrie stepped outside for a moment, just long enough to smell the air, the trees, the snow. She closed her eyes. Then she turned, pulled the felt closed behind her, and went to stir the pot. The fire was still warm, and the story, like the smoke, rose quietly once again. The snow did not ask permission to stay. It simply came, like breath drawn into lungs. And in the Norse lands it came heavy and deep and long. The people did not resist it. They lived in rhythm with it, as one lives with an old, stubborn relative, respectfully, patiently, with occasional quiet curses, and often with love. Winter was not an interruption in the Viking world. It was a season with its own logic, its own weight. It gave no space for hurry, and it forgave no carelessness. But in return it offered clarity, the kind found only in silence and dark and firelight. A Norse longhouse in winter was not grand, not warm in the way we think of warmth today, but it was alive. Alive with the sound of breath and boiling broth, with the creak of roof beams and the murmur of old songs sung half asleep. Wood smoke painted every surface, softening the edges of life until everything, furs, faces, hands, stone tools, felt blurred and timeless. Each morning was not so much begun as it was endured. Someone always rose first, lighting the coals again, coaxing life from ash. There were no clocks, no alarms, only the pace of the season and the needs of the household. Water was fetched in buckets made slick with frost. Meat was sliced thin and fried on flat stones. Children were bundled, not so much for going out, but simply to stay warm. And yet, for all its hardship, winter held a quiet magic. Not the magic of spells or fire-breathing gods, but the kind found in familiarity. The click of bone against wood in a loom, the rasp of a knife through deer hide, the stillness between words spoken across a hearth. Each act, though simple, was part of something larger, a network of survival and meaning that stretched generations. In the silence between storms, voices told stories. Some were practical, how to mend a trap line, how to store fish beneath the ice without it spoiling, how to make nettle thread strong enough for weaving. Others were more mysterious, about spirits in the trees, gods beneath the sea, and wolves whose howls were omens of things unseen. They spoke of Thor's hammer keeping the roof strong, of Freya's cats watching over children in sleep, of the Norns, the spinners of fate, who wove even the smallest acts, dropping a cup, finding a feather, into the larger thread of destiny. And yet, much of daily life was quiet. Men checked nets beneath the fjord ice, moving slow and careful. A misstep could mean freezing, but they knew the cold, just as they knew the cracks in the river's skin. Women patched old tunics and cleaned fish bones, softening them for carving into needles and clasps. Children fetched kindling and took turns stirring broth, watching with fascination as wild herbs floated like ghosts in the pot. The cold was a fact, a presence. It seeped into the wood, into the wool, into the lungs. But in time the body learned its shape, and the mind stopped fighting it. People shared more in winter, not because they had more, but because they had less. Less movement, less distraction, fewer chances to outrun each other's moods. So they sat close. They talked longer. They knew when someone was quiet in the wrong way. They watched each other's breath, measured it like time. And then there was the fire. It was the heart of it all. Not only for heat, but for being seen, for being together. It was where stories began and where sleep circled, pulling people gently into dreams. The Norse believed the world would end in winter, that Ragnarok, the great unraveling, would begin with frost. And yet they built their lives in its very center, not afraid, but aware. They took from the season what it gave, clarity, stillness, and the knowledge that nothing is truly permanent. Elders remembered other winters, some harsher, some gentler. They recalled years when the snow came early, or when the fjord froze so thick even the deer refused to cross it. They passed these stories on, not as warnings, but as offerings. Here is how we endured, they said. Here is how you might too. Children were not shielded from this truth. They were taught to respect the ice, to read the sky, to follow tracks and signs and silences. But they also played, laughed, threw snow and carved runes into icicles. They told their own small stories where bears spoke and stars were watching eyes and dreams were doors to the gods. Even laughter in winter was sacred. And in those rare moments when the clouds parted and the stars stretched endless above the world, when Jormungandr, the great serpent, stirred beneath the sea and the sky hinted at colours no fire could make, people looked up and remembered that they were not alone, that their lives, as small and brief as they might seem, were part of something vast. In those stars they saw the old ones watching. In the fire they saw their own ancestors leaning close, and in each breath drawn against the cold, they found proof of their place in the weave of things. Winter did not end with fanfare. There was no clear day when one could say, now it is spring. It ended in sighs, in slow thaws, in boots that left deeper prints in melting snow, in air that no longer bit but only kissed. But long before that, before the ice receded and the world turned soft again, there was this. A morning where the smoke curled just a little higher, a child sleeping a little later, a longhouse full of stories, still glowing with warmth, even in the deepest part of winter. That was the truth of it. That was life in a Norse village, in the long dark, a slow unfolding of firelight, held in the hands of those who knew how to wait and how to listen. Thank you for spending this time here, for walking the quiet halls of the past with me. It means more than you know. I hope something in this story made you feel calm, or seen, or simply not so alone in the hush of night. If you'd like to join this growing circle of quiet minds, you're warmly invited to subscribe to Obscure Chronicle. And if you'd like to share how the story felt for you, or even just tell me where you're listening from, I'd love to read it in the comments. We are all part of history. Not the loud parts perhaps, but the soft ones, the ones that matter. So rest now, deeply. I'll be here again soon. Until then, sleep warm, sleep safe. Good night.